Hi, it's Peter Schweizer, and welcome to the Drill Down. Well, you might have had a bad 6 months, but consider George Soros. In January, he got the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and now President Donald Trump is saying he should be charged under RICO. Is this the direction we want to go? What is RICO, and would it actually apply to George Soros and his activities? We're going to unpack that today. The co-host and co-pilot of this program, Eric Eggers. Eric, how are you? How have your 6 months been?
Probably not as good as George Soros, because despite all the circumstances that you just laid out, he is, after all, still a billionaire. So he's probably okay.
Yeah.
You know, as the kids say, his cope is okay. You know, he's okay. George is fine.
Well, so, Donald Trump, of course, a lot of people now know, tweeted out that George Soros and his son Alex should be charged under RICO. A lot of people think, oh, this is a crazy tweet from Donald Trump. But actually, the fact of the matter is RICO has been used in the past. We're going to unpack this. And there are perhaps instances which would speak to the fact that RICO could potentially apply against George Soros. But you were telling me earlier, as we were talking about this, that actually the tweet is just sort of the latest iteration. There has actually been discussions about applying RICO. So before we get to what RICO is, tell us a little bit how this has been raised in the past and by whom.
It is interesting to consider that, like, we're talking about it because Donald Trump did tweet about it. And, now that once he successfully got Cracker Barrel to change their logo back, it's like, what else can I do? Let me fire up the magic machine here.
Right.
I mean, he literally tweeted today about, enforcing voter ID at the federal level, which does not appear to be a thing you can do at the federal level for lots of other laws and reasons.
Right.
But anyway, so he's feeling very emboldened and empowered. And so some people think that the things he tweets out are just these like unhinged one-offs. But in fact, this is actually, I think, just the culmination of a number of activities that have taken place by other elected leaders that say, no, I think there's very real cause for concern about the activities and the protests that have been happening throughout this country this year and the money behind it. So you had a House committee say we're going to do an investigation into one of these groups that we'll talk about in a little bit, named Churla, who has gotten a decent amount of George Soros money. You also had a Senator, Josh Hawley from Missouri, say, look, we should be investigating this. So he is hardly the first one. I think, if anything, he is crystallizing the legal mechanism by which those investigations might actually bear fruit. We hear all the time from people that, we talk about things that make people upset, and they say, that's terrible, but who will actually go to jail for this? And here you have Donald Trump actually, I think, speaking to a mechanism by which you put some teeth on it, if you like.
Yeah, exactly. So let's be clear. First of all, Eric and I, neither one of us are lawyers. We've never been prosecutors, but we are researchers.
Or prosecuted.
Thank God. Especially under
So we
RICO.
literally have no expertise on any of this.
Well, we are researchers. We do study this stuff. And here's the thing you have to understand about RICO. It is not illegal for George Soros, or for that matter, Elon Musk, or anybody else to make contributions to political causes. It's not illegal to fund groups that support your agenda. The question under RICO involves illegal criminal activity. And what RICO requires, there's a federal law, RICO, and then several states adopted state-level laws. This is the law that originated as an effort to combat the mafia. And the idea is, if there's a criminal enterprise taking place, you just don't want to get the one guy low on the totem pole
who's doing the thing,
who actually did the thing. If his bosses ordered him to do it, equipped him to do it, funded him to do it, and he committed the crime, they could be charged under RICO. And to violate the federal RICO Act, a prosecution must establish that a group of individuals who are part of an enterprise or an association have been involved in a pattern of racketeering, which involves committing 2 of 27 listed crimes within 10 years, and that the pattern of racketeering has an effect on interstate or foreign commerce. In other words, it has to be a national enterprise. The federal government in its law can't just pick on a state. So the question comes down to, has George Soros or other funders, have they actually funded entities that were engaged in criminal conduct? That is really the bottom line when it comes to the RICO statute.
Now, Donald Trump is also not a lawyer, although unlike us, he actually has been prosecuted. But he actually is, he should be, if not familiar, he's at least been RICO adjacent, because he has literally been charged with this in Georgia. He was that famous Trump mugshot in fact, came from when he turned himself in to the Fulton County Jail because he was charged with RICO violations as it related to his activities, allegedly attempting to overturn the results of the 2020 election.
Yeah.
Now, at that time, the New York Times and other entities, they sort of unpacked and they talked about the Georgia RICO statute allows prosecutors to bundle together what may seem unrelated crimes committed by a host of different people. Now, it's just an interesting quote from a law professor. It says it allows a prosecutor to go after the head of an organization loosely defined without having to prove that head directly engaged in a conspiracy or any acts that violated state law. So that would seem to suggest that George Soros would not have to have been aware of the activities and didn't commit any crimes themselves. And by the way, there is an interesting level of legal precedent to this. There we have a case, the National Organization for Women actually successfully used RICO in a civil case against anti-abortion protesters. And while that went through a lot of different legal machinations, ultimately the Supreme Court upheld that RICO didn't require, quote, an economic motive. And so basically it creates some precedent that courts were willing to allow using RICO to apply to political movements and their supporters.
So literally, if you were injured, let's say, in a protest by, let's say, some type of Antifa group, you were injured, you could actually sue under RICO the Antifa group, and you could sue the people that were actually funding that entity. That's kind of what that case sets the precedent for. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you said about Soros or anybody else that was sued under RICO. The law you don't have to prove that the head of the entity knew that they were going to engage in criminal activity. All you have to show is they should have known, right? So if you had a radical group somewhere in Milwaukee, and I, as a funder, said, you know what, I'm going to fund this group, and I know they have a history of violent protests, and I fund them anyway, even if I never directed or was involved in making the decision to engage in violent protests, I would still be charged under RICO. That is what the interesting. So what are examples of this? If you were to make a case or try to make a legal case that George Soros engaged in RICO violations, what you would have to show is that his entity was involved in funding entities that engaged in illegal activity. In this case, the allegation would be criminal violent protests.
Yeah, and there's a mechanism we should talk about that the audience may be aware of, because it's not like George Soros just takes out his checkbook and sends it to in your Milwaukee Thugs.
Right.
Although that would make an excellent WNBA team. So, but what he does do is he funnels lots of money to a couple different groups under this network called the Arabella Network.
Right.
And so they have two main funds that you'll hear us refer to. But earlier this summer, we talked about how we could trace the Arabella Advisors network funneling $114 million to these groups behind all the No Kings protests. Now, it's interesting because those No King protests, there was a lot of speculation. Those were not violent, by and large. In fact, it seemed actually kind of astroturfed, a lot of like white beta libs, older people showing up, and so it was not.
They weren't
energy.
Thrown down with the cops.
They were not. They take naps, in fact. So, but these guys are funneling money into lots of groups, and some of these groups from the Arabella Network have been connected to protests that have turned violent.
Right.
Two of them, the Community Change Action Firm and CHURLA, which is the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights in Los Angeles, were involved in the anti-ICE riots, and they got about $5 million from Soros-funded Arabella groups.
Exactly. So these are two entities that were involved in violent protests, which is, criminal conduct. Now, you have some prosecutors that don't prosecute them, but you are still committing a crime when you're engaged in violent protests. So that's an example of what Arabella did. There was, by the way, those riots were estimated to cost $30 million, the damage that was caused. The Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights in Los Angeles was accused by Josh Harley of fomenting, quote unquote, unlawful unrest. And they received nearly $5 million in grants from the 1630 and New Venture Fund, which are, again, these kind of progressive entities. I don't know if Soros gave specifically to those, but there were funders. There were wealthy individuals that were funding those. There's some other examples to unpack and talk about in this regard. Pro-Palestinian protesters that have turned violent. The nonprofit Tides Foundation is given over $22 million to different causes in this area. Tides, of course, has received money from Soros and has worked at some level with his organizations. They gave $650,000 to the Jewish Voice for Peace, $710,000 to the Adallah Justice Project, $86,000 to If Not Now, $38,000 to the Center for Constitutional Rights, $600,000 to the Mass Liberation Project, $132,000 to Westpac Foundations, and that includes Students for Justice in Palestine. Now, some of these groups are not engaged in violent protests, but some are. And so, again, you have another area where potentially you could see a pattern is forming, that this is not just a one-off, that there are several organizations that receive funding from Soros and or other investors that are engaged and have in the past been engaged in criminal, violent protests.
Yeah, I think the example that stands out the most to me, and it's kind of just interesting, and it's especially interesting because it takes place in Atlanta, which, by the way, was also where Donald Trump was faced with these RICO charges or coming out of the Atlanta office. And oh, by the way, this case actually did lead to RICO charges. But so there was something called Cop City in Atlanta. So what it was is the Atlantic Public Safety Training Center. They announced a partnership with the City of Atlanta and Atlanta Police Foundation. They're going to basically build this training ground for police officers. It was going to have a shooting range and a mock village. And so that's why, it's this thing they're going to build to help law enforcement.
Yeah. And by the way, we want cops to be trained, right? I mean, the problem when you have, police brutality or problems is usually because they're not well trained or not well organized. So this is a good thing.
Yeah, not everyone agreed, actually, as it turns out, because in order to build this training center, they had to take over a part of a forest that was near the thing they're going to use as the base. And so beginning in late 2021, you got to remember 2021, so George Floyd, summer 2020, still got a lot of anti-police activities. People started to occupy the protest in and around the area where they're trying to build this quote-unquote cop city. And so, this is they call themselves the forest defenders. They're trying to prevent trees from being cut. And they would just sort of living in there. Now, a couple of different raids take place because they're trying to get these people out of the forest so the construction can continue. And in January of 2023, Georgia State Troopers launch a raid, and one of the police officers is shot. They fire back, and so a protester who was from Venezuela is shot and killed. And so this starts this big thing. So then in March of 2023, dozens of people attacked the Cop City construction site with rocks and firebombs, destroying construction equipment. So the point of all that is to say, we know through some research that George Soros donated to multiple groups through something called Network for Strong Communities that funded those groups. And the people behind that activity actually were ultimately charged. 61 people charged with RICO violations by the Georgia Attorney General's office. So, I mean, that's as close as you can find, again, as non-lawyers, to, hey, the people were charged with RICO for actually participating in some of these activities. What I think Donald Trump is suggesting, which we should talk about whether you like the idea or not, but what Donald Trump is suggesting is that maybe the people supporting those groups who's funding it can also be charged, because the people who were the leaders of these groups were ultimately charged in Georgia with RICO violations.
Yeah, and to be clear, I think you're making an important distinction here. The RICO charges were against the people on the ground. So to use our analogy before, the RICO statutes were created to deal with organized crime. You don't want to just deal with the thug who's shaking down people on the street corner. You want to get to his bosses. So the question is, should RICO in that case apply to the funders, the people that are sitting in their comfortable offices funding these groups that are involved in violent protests? So yeah, that is a really, I think, stunning example of what we're talking about. Network for Strong Communities is involved. There's another example that we can turn to as well, and that involves the vandalism and the attack on the Tesla dealerships. Remember, this was a thing earlier in the year. I don't know if it's still going on, but the Soros Open Society Network sent a minimum of $8 million to the Indivisible Project between 2021 and 2023. Local chapters of the Indivisible Project organized about 29% or 87 of the Tesla takedown protests. The individual project said that they did not, organize all these protests. They kind of tried to deny it, but those were specifically designed to intimidate Musk, who was working with the government. They were violent. There were fires that were set, et cetera.
Talk about intimidation. You literally see Teslas now with bumper stickers essentially saying, like, please don't key me. I don't necessarily support Elon Musk. I mean, it did create a culture of intimidation across the country.
Yeah. And look, here's the thing, as far as I'm concerned. Do we want people funding legitimate political activities? Absolutely. If you are a progressive, you should be able to do it. If you're Elon Musk and you're supporting Trump, you should be able to do it. The question is, what happens if you are funding actions that are not part of the legitimate political process? And by legitimate political process, I mean engaged in violence. Violence is illegal. We know that the RICO statutes have been used in the past against white supremacist groups, for example. This is the way they took down some of those networks in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And again, the idea was we're not going to just get the guys that are part of the group. We're going to get the backers, the people that are funding it. And to me, that seems to be a very legitimate function of law enforcement because it will deter people. George Soros should be able to fund whatever he wants as long as it's not something that entails funding violent criminal behavior.
So, for example, it's been reported this week that George Soros was also funding influencers on the left, like giving millions of dollars to it. If to the extent that you're funding these groups that are having protests, it's kind of like astroturfing activity on the ground. But what it also looks like is they're involved in astroturfing conversations online.
Yes.
And so it's kind of a scandal, and people are like, why would you spend that much money on these C-list internet people? Which honestly just made me feel old because I didn't know who any of those people were. So there's no worry, drill down listeners. Neither of your hosts here are influenced by the George Soros because we don't know who those people are. They have not influenced us. But to the point, like if George Soros wants to spend his money that way, I've seen some analysis that in the post-Citizens United world, you can do that. Like you can spend as much money as you want to in lots of different media and communication and influence. That's not illegal. But funding groups that cause violence because that's a crime or destroy property, things like that.
That's where RICO would come in.
You would actually come in. And so, like you can have the conversation. Do you want the president of the United States kind of behind calling out should people who are political opponents be charged with crimes? We certainly didn't like it, ironically, when the person that charged him with RICO violations, Fannie Willis, was like walking the red carpet at the White House press correspondence dinner. And here at a thing celebrating Joe Biden, and here's this person who's charging his political opponent. It was a really bad look, and we called it out. We said it's not good. Does it bother you that Donald Trump is calling for potential law enforcement actions against a political opponent?
Well, I think that in American politics, this has been going on for 15 years. The real question to me is the Department of Justice. And I have confidence in the Department of Justice that they're going to evaluate the evidence. They're looking at the evidence. As you mentioned, a congressional committee has explored this already. And to me, the question is not ultimately what is Donald Trump's desire. It's what does the evidence show? And if the evidence does show a pattern of funding organizations engaged in illegal activity, that is criminal activity, then I think charges would be warranted. Again, I'm not an attorney. I haven't looked at it in that regard. So, what Trump says or doesn't say from the legal standpoint, ultimately, I don't think matters because everybody knows this is Trump's thing. Trump thinks out loud. He says things out loud. He throws things up to see if they're going to stick. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And that to me is noise. The real question is, A, is the Department of Justice looking at this? They should be. And B, are they going to be driven by the evidence? Unlike what happened in the last administration with Trump, where it seems pretty clearly when you look at how those cases fared actually in the court of law, that they did not have a legal basis for them.
Full credit to Newt Gingrich, by the way, who said on this podcast exactly what would happen, that all 4 of those cases would fall on their own merits. And we at the time were like, okay, Newt. But he did. He was exactly correct, and it's interesting. But I will say this. You talk about actions and saying things out loud and evidence. The most maybe relevant thing, just in terms of like the change in the culture of the way the left views George Soros, is not something that Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, but it is something that someone else did say, or at least announce, and that's Bill Gates.
Yes.
I think that's the most relevant thing as it relates to the way these activities are being seen and these associations with these groups because of some of that, because of the protests and the destruction of property and some other, potentially illegal activity. What did Bill Gates say that we should be aware of this week?
Bill Gates essentially walked away from these Soros-affiliated groups, I think Arabella Partners. And, Bill Gates clearly is a guy on the political side of the spectrum, the left side of the political spectrum, progressive, supports a lot of these issues. It's unclear. He hasn't explicitly said why he stepped away, but it is interesting, the timing. Trump makes this announcement that there should be prosecutions, and then Gates literally, I think the next day, comes out and says, you know what, I'm detaching myself from Arabella Partners. So it's going to be interesting to see the calculations that other people might be making with regards to these entities and perhaps some of the things they're funding.
I have a theory about why he might have walked away, but just to be clear, it's no small loss for the Soros Fund. You got Bill Gates through the Gates Foundation has plowed, we've done some reporting, $450 million into the network since 2008. So, I mean, that's a lot of money.
A lot of change.
Yeah. So it's possible that it's because of the perception and the connection because of what Trump is saying. Look, we're going to go on offense now, and Soros is somebody we're going to go on offense. That might be one of the reasons why Bill Gates walked away. It might also be true that Alex Soros, his son, is getting married to Huma Abedin, the former Clinton aide, and maybe in a fit of rage one night, Huma Abedin was like, "Man, team sucks." And Bill's like, "That's it, I'm out. $450 million. I can't get some product placement over here."
So let me ask you, would you favor a ceasefire, right? They threw all these legal charges against Trump, which were clearly, politically hatched. None of them really had any basis in law, even though everybody back, these same outlets that are now concerned about, RICO applying to George Soros were backing RICO with Donald Trump. Would you favor a ceasefire if it could be enforced where we just don't go this direction anymore? Or do you believe that these things should be investigated? I think they should, but the challenge, of course, is who's in office, and are they going to evaluate them fairly?
You didn't like it when Joe Biden was doing it, right? You didn't like it, and I think it also depends on what's the actual thing that's happening. With Donald Trump, I think, as someone who wrote a book called How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election in 2018, I did not have a problem with him asking serious questions about what happened in 2020. So to charge him with RICO and the other people that were with him, I thought was actually among the more scandalous moments in American history. It's censorship. It's like using the weight of law to try to, we should be able to receive questions about validity. That's what freedom looks like. So I did not like the issue that they used to charge him on. Yeah. But I think the idea that you're charging political opponents, so you're right. Is it the issue in this case? If there's actual crimes being committed,
right?
To me, the legal threshold, just based on this conversation, would be how can you prove that George Soros should have known,
right,
or would have known that these groups would be involved in things that ultimately would break the law?
Yeah, no, that is the ultimate question. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I hope DOJ is looking at it because, again, I don't think whether it's left, right, or center, we should not be having people that are funding and encouraging political violence on our streets. That was my view on January 6th, and that is certainly my view here today. One other bit of news real quick I want to touch on because you are the kind of election fraud stuff. So Donald Trump says he's issuing an executive order requiring paper ballots, right, in the name of fighting fraud and voter ID, mandatory voter ID. Does he actually have the authority to do that?
Far be it from me to tell Donald Trump what he can or can't do. I will say this: when we had the opportunity and privilege to fill in for Sean Hannity on the radio last week, we had Harmeet Dillon on, and we asked her about how you leverage federal money to get states to kind of do stuff. And I think using the voter rolls is the smartest way to do it. Like if you're trying to enact meaningful election integrity reform, the voter rolls is where I would start. I think voter ID is also a great thing. But she said, look, we are getting the state's voter roll. I've actually made some news in that interview we did because she's like, no, we are getting every state's voter rolls. Not all of them want to comply, but we will get them and we will look at them. So I think that the two most meaningful things that they could do are clean up the voter rolls, and require an ID would be great.
Yeah.
But it remains a very contentious issue. Remember, like actually back to the state of Georgia, because there were so many questions about how Georgia conducted its election in 2020 with drop boxes that were put in key places that were favorable to Democrats and nobody watching the ballot boxes and all those things. Georgia passed a law, said, all right, fine, we're going to try to make our elections more secure. People lost their mind so much, they tried to get Delta to leave Atlanta. and Atlanta literally lost the Major League Baseball All-Star game.
Yeah,
so
I
it remains
remember
an
that,
incredibly emotionally charged issue. So to me, just full credit to Donald Trump for even taking on. Saying voter ID a while ago would have been something that had you accused of being racist.
Yeah.
And I think that's just another thing that he's like, forget it. We have like a real mandate, and we're going to do what we can to make elections more secure.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not sure that the president has the authority to do this, but I'm glad he's raising the issue. And the way he does this oftentimes is with a bully pulpit, right? He realizes he can't do it, but he tries to encourage people to do the right thing. So what is your view, your prediction? Are there going to be any RICO indictments, whether it's George Soros or not, or whether it's somebody else? Do you think this is a path forward where the Department of Justice is going to start making RICO charges against these political organizations that engage in violence?
I don't think so, only because, but I think what it does is it spurs a lot of conversations. Oh, this is what dictators do. This is what authoritarians do. But I do think if it's changing the conversation, elevating an awareness of just how shady and potentially damaging these groups are, and it's causing people like Bill Gates, who have backed them for 2 decades plus, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, to walk away, that I think is actually more significant.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be ultimately the thing that addresses these issues.
What about you?
I think that we may actually see, I don't know legally whether Soros or his senior executives are culpable, but I think at some level we're going to see that. We're seeing it in Georgia. It may not be a name that people recognize, but I do think we are going to see this because I'm anticipating there are going to be more violent protests going forward. This is kind of where the left has decided they're going. They found it was successful in 2020. In their mind, there were not enough violent protests in 2024, and so I think they're going to ramp it up. And this is, I think, the next logical step, and I say good for them. I'm glad they're doing it.
I'm just smiling because I can see the headline now. Schweizer, violent leftist protests will continue and increase.
Well, we appreciate you, as always, taking the time to listen to this podcast. We know your time is valuable. You can find out more about the work that we do at thedrilldown.com, and please consider subscribing to this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.